Welcome, everyone. I'm glad you're here. This is a conversation in our series at Spirituality and Practice that we call Off the Page, where we sit down with the author of an important new book and hear directly from their mouth what it's all about and why it should be important to you and why it is important in the world. And I'm delighted that we have Carl Siciliano with us today. He is the author of Making Room. I think you can see that, Making Room. That's my sophisticated way of product placement, Carl. Welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me, John. It's an honor to be here.
I'm not going to give a long introduction to you, Carl, because we're going to be hearing all about you now for the next 45, 50 minutes. I want to just dive right in and give you sort of the softball question. I never say this to authors, actually, but just tell us about your book. Tell us about the Ali Forney Center. Tell us how you got involved in the work that you do in the world, which is what your book is all about.
Sure. So about 30 years ago, I started working with homeless youth in New York City at a drop-in center in Times Square. And I had worked with homeless adults for about 10 years prior to that. I'd also spent some time in several monasteries as a postulant, and I'd also been involved with the Catholic worker movement for about 4 years. So I had a lot of experience with homelessness, but I was shocked when I started working with the homeless youth. Uh, in New York City, I was used to the idea that homeless people had a right to shelter. There had been a lawsuit in New York City in the late 80s that established that homeless people had a right to shelter. But in fact, what I quickly realized was that homeless youth, that didn't apply to. And most of the young people that I worked with were stranded on the streets and suffered horribly. Many became addicted to drugs. Many became very involved with the criminal justice system. Many survived through sex work, prostitution, and were becoming infected with HIV and AIDS at a time when it was still very much a disease without a cure, or without viable treatment. And what I quickly saw was that the LGBT youth had it by far the worst. There was one shelter in New York City run by a religious organization that was very discriminatory to LGBT youth and did a very poor job at protecting them from the violence of others. So they were just stranded out in the streets and suffered horribly. As a gay man, I found it very disturbing to see how even within homelessness there was kind of a caste system, and that the LGBT youth, experienced by far the most violence and discrimination. And the first day I started there, I met this remarkable young person, Ali Forney, who just had a profound impact on my life and on my vision for how to be a queer person in the world, and in a lot of ways how to kind of rehabilitate my faith that was really struggling because of the Catholic Church's hostility to queer people. So that was what prompted me to write the book. When I first brought it to the publisher that ended up publishing the book, they said they saw it as a queer Just Mercy. And I was like, okay, I better go back and look at Just Mercy. But, I saw with Just Mercy that Bryan Stevenson talks about the death penalty and fighting the death penalty and the evils of the death penalty through the prism of his relationship with a man named Walter who was on the death penalty. And I can see what they meant, because in this book, I'm really looking at LGBT youth homelessness, resisting societal contempt and neglect. And through the prism of my relationship with Ali Frenay. Uh, it was interesting though, because, I saw that Brian Stevenson framed his book around kind of core Christian concepts of mercy and redemption, and kind of calling society to task for how in how we incarcerate people and how we kill people, how we violate those principles. And I thought, I don't know that I can really do the same thing in a queer context, because the language of Christianity, and more broadly religion, has been so used to persecute and oppress LGBT people. But then I found myself thinking, maybe like leaning into that paradox and contradiction would actually, in fact, make for a rich and complex book. So I decided in a lot of ways to kind of frame the book as a spiritual memoir. Uh, and as a unifying principle, I looked at how Ali and I each found spiritual integrity by resisting the religious devaluation of queer people. So, John, I apologize if that's a very long-winded answer, but
No, no, I was looking for that kind of a long-winded answer. And you then give me, a various places to go from there. And one of them is to stick with your story, because it is a memoir. It's a memoir that tells about important work that's being done in New York, but it's also your story. And I know that readers want to know more about you. I found it very interesting how you wove your story throughout the book. And as you alluded to in that answer, your personal story of disappointment with the Catholic Church, which, I think I'm a bad Catholic myself. So I totally get it, the disappointment with the church. And I want to hear more about that. And I loved the fact that as you taught the chapter where you really got into your personal story of disappointment with the church is the story in which you also tell the story of your coming out. And I loved the fact that you titled that chapter Fidelity. So could you tell folks a bit about that?
oh gosh. John, there's something that I just spoke about very briefly in that chapter, but I was so religious.
Yeah.
Like, I'd had this mystical experience when I was 15 that just became the gravitational center of my life. And, I was just completely obsessed with, how do I give myself completely to God? How do I come to union with God? And, I was profoundly influenced by Thomas Merton, Dorothy Day, but also very much Charles de Foucault and Thérèse of Lisieux. And I had spent several years in Catholic worker houses, uh, and in monasteries. I lived for a time in the Benedictine Grange. I don't know if you ever heard of that, but one of your past guests, Sister Kathleen Degnan, was very involved in that community,
Yeah.
and is a friend of mine. Um, and there was just this sense that, like, I had to strip myself of something. Uh, I had a real devotion to Saint Francis of Assisi and poverty. Uh, and I really had the sense that there was like a stripping involved in the spiritual process, like a stripping of power, of privilege on an external level, on an internal level, maybe a stripping of concepts.
Well, that's a very Franciscan thing, of course,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. But like there was just a sense, that like I wasn't there, like I wasn't getting it, like there was something holding me back. And a friend of mine and I went on this 5-week pilgrimage where we were visiting all these like shrines and cathedrals and monasteries in France and Spain in the summer of 1985. And I we ended up spending a week in Lisieux. And, we both had huge devotions to Saint Therese. And one day I was in the crypt of her church, and I was just really wrestling with this sense of like I was called to a deeper level of poverty, and I didn't know what it meant. And I heard this voice saying, I mean, not like I heard a voice, it was like an internal thing, but
Yeah.
saying, Carl, you're gay. Like, deal with it. Just be honest. And uh, you want to be united with people that are oppressed, then don't try to hide the part of yourself that is subject to oppression. So I didn't know what to do with that. In a lot of ways, I think I used my religion to avoid dealing with my sexuality up to that point. Um,
Yeah.
I was very like into the idea that to really have union with God, you had to kind of take your sexual energy and put it to the spiritual quest. Um, so I didn't want to be sexual even. Uh, but yeah, no, that was. I mean, it took me about 18 months after that mandate in the crypt of the Basilica at Lisieux for me to get the courage to come out. In fact, I was a monk at the Monastery of Christ in the Desert in New Mexico. Uh, 18 months later, in fact, it was the 100th anniversary of Therese's conversion. She had this conversion that she described on Christmas Eve of 1886, where she just suddenly had this powerful experience of God's grace kind of curing her of something that was holding her back. And I mean, I don't want to scandalize your listeners, but I went to bed. I was so devoted to Therese that I was sure I would have some kind of transformative experience. And I had a wet dream about this guy that I had a crush on in New
Oh
York.
my.
And so, and I woke up with this conviction that I just had to come out of the closet. So I sort of see Saint Therese as being the patroness of my spiritual liberation, of my sexual liberation, and my spiritual liberation, really. So there we go.
Wow, that was a scandal. No, thank you for the honesty. I mean, as you were describing that, I was remembering, you probably know Ronald Rollheiser. Have you heard his sort of idea that we all have a sacred fire that
I'm not
when you're
familiar.
describing the trying to just, sort of bottle up your sexuality or turn it into something else, I was thinking about Ronald Rollheiser's idea of sacred fire, which is not bottling it up, but it is kind of turning it into something else. I mean, or at least it's the idea that your sexuality is sacred and it is fiery and it has to express somewhere somehow. And did you find after you left the monastery that I mean, again, I don't want to get explicit or anything, but I mean, did you find that when you came out, when you allowed yourself to be who you were, that your spiritual practice actually went deeper, or became transformed, became what you maybe didn't know that it could have been before when you were trying to deny the whole thing?
Not immediately. Um, in fact, I would say that for about 7 years, I was rather derailed. Um, it was such a hard time to be a queer Catholic. Um,
I didn't realize it was an easy time now.
yeah, well, I don't know that there's ever been an easy time, but
No.
it was a particularly fraught time, I would say. Right before I went to the monastery, on October 1st of 1986, Cardinal Ratzinger, or later to become Pope Benedict, released this letter on the pastoral care of homosexuals or something, or maybe it was called The Problem of Homosexuals. Um, where he said that homosexuality was an intrinsic inclination towards evil, and that any effort to welcome or accept LGBT people, on their own terms in the church had to be suppressed and forbidden. I remember being in the monastery, like reading this document and just feeling like my heart was being ripped in half. In fact, like, we were quiet, like we weren't supposed to make noise. So one day I hiked like a mile away from the monastery to read the thing because I just knew I couldn't read it in silence. And I still was afraid I would upset the monks. So I remember like standing there in silence, like throwing rocks and logs across the Rio Chama to like express my rage and anger. Um, and then when I came back to New York, I was part of a group of gay Catholics called Dignity that used to meet at St. Francis Xavier Church. And, about 6 weeks after I came out of the closet, right after, leaving the monastery, the cardinal threw Dignity out, said that any priest, any pastor that welcomed Dignity into a Catholic church would be fired. So there was a sense that that was the time when the Catholic Church was finally kind of responding to the gay rights movement, about 18 years after it started. And its response was a real markup, a real ramping up of hostilities. And then simultaneously, I was making friends with a lot of openly gay men in New York, many of whom had AIDS. A lot of my friends were dying. And the church's kind of opposition to condom usage, to safer sex education, just struck me as being murderous and even genocidal. So I was really derailed for about 7 years, where I just was so upset and so angry and felt betrayed and heartbroken. And that was one of the profound impacts that Ali Frenay had on me. Ali, didn't come from a Catholic tradition, was more like in a kind of Pentecostal tradition, but was just profoundly marked by faith. And Ali had been thrown out of their home when they were 13 years old and had, lived on the streets in really horrific conditions for about 6 or 7 years by the time I met them. We would put on a talent show at this program that I was running, Safe Space, and Ali would always close the show by singing a gospel hymn, usually horribly out of tune. And then Ali would like launch into this kind of freeform, sanctified preaching. And it would always revolve around this theme of like, it doesn't matter if I'm a man in a wig and a dress. God loves me for who I am. God has mercy on all people, and God loves me for who I am. And, I was just awestruck and dumbfounded watching Ali do this. Recently I was talking to one of the directors of the show who said that like they've seen actors spend 50 years trying to express the inner depths of their selves as effortlessly as Ali could, like immediately. Like Ali had this access to this kind of real core, deep soul place, and could just put that out there in front of like, all of their friends, all of their peers. There was something so humble about it and so powerful about it, and so faithful about it. So yeah, I call that chapter Fidelity, and or actually no, the chapter before that I think was called Fidelity, but I think Ali helped me realize that I could integrate the spiritual and the sexual in a way that had felt broken before that.
I should pause to remind people that I'm Jon Sweeney, and I'm here talking with Carl Siciliano, who's the author of Making Room, published a few months ago in paperback by Convergent Books. I would love actually to ask you more questions along this line, but I have a hunch I should move it along. I mean, for instance, I want to hear about Dorothy Day and your experience learning from Dorothy Day and arguing with Dorothy Day and the Catholic worker movement. But I also want to get to the kids that you've worked with for 30 years. And I want you to tell us some stories about some of the kids, because I know that's what your book is really about. I mean, it's what your life is really about, is working with these kids. So can you tell us
Well,
about
I want
some
to
of
tell you something. I I experienced some painful homophobia at the Catholic worker.
I know, I
And
know.
I think that a lot of, I mean, I got there a few years after Dorothy Day died, but in coming to like understand the community, I saw that a fair amount of it was rooted in Dorothy's kind of hatred of human sexuality.
Yeah.
Um, Having said that, though, I think Dorothy is a remarkable woman and a holy woman and has deeply inspired me. Um, uh, and something that I find very paradoxical is that, for about 30 years after the Stonewall Uprising, homeless queer youth were largely just left out in the streets. The LGBT rights movement that emerged was not responsive to the fact that hundreds of thousands of kids were being thrown away. And the reasons for that I think are complex. I can go into it if you want, but it was certainly the fact that I was so rooted in a vision that was inspired by Dorothy that enabled me to see that, like, when kids are homeless, you need to shelter them, you need to house them. Um, so I think that my being like a Catholic worker uh, brought me to a place where I was able to have these experiences with these young people over the last 30 years, of seeking to house them and protect them and treating them as though they deserved human dignity, which was not happening before.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, tell us about a few of them, will you? The kids.
So, God, I've know like 10,000 kids, so it's hard to. I'll talk about like a core theme that I've seen that has just kept reappearing and which I find personally torturous. The overwhelming majority of the young people that come to us at the Ali Forney Center and who came to us at Safe Space, where I first met Ali, um, are rejected by their families because of their families' religious backgrounds. Um, the young people are told that they're sinners, that they're abominations, that they're shameful before God. Um, and when I opened the Ali Forney Center in 2002, one of the first young people that stayed with us was a transgender young man who hadn't yet begun their transition. So they first came to us identifying as female, but their mother was very religious, and when she found out that her child was queer, she attacked him, ripped out a piece of his scalp, and the child ran down the steps of their apartment building, fearing for his life. And she was like screaming, like, "You'll be back. The faggots will never take care of you." Um, a young man that I knew, I remember him telling me how his mother, said that she was so ashamed that she had a faggot for a son and that she hoped that he got AIDS and died. Um, I think of a young transgender man whose mother would make him sit up all night copying passages from Leviticus and St. Paul condemning homosexuality. Like she would just make him sit up all night, like writing these things over and over and over again. Um, so that has been for me the hardest and the most torturous part of the work. Um, Being so profoundly influenced by a spiritual tradition and seeing that tradition used to assault and degrade and oppress and hurt so badly all these kids in my care. Um, it's hard to know how to cope with that.
I'm sure it is. You're making me think of something I was reading earlier today. And I underlined a couple of sentences thinking I might ask you about this. There's a new book by George Patterson. It has nothing to do with your book, but there's a new book by George Patterson, who's a Anglican sort of retired priest and theologian who I like, who writes very philosophically. It's a book called A Philosophy of Prayer. And he talks about, he loves the saints in the way that you have this love of the saints. And he talks about the tradition of tears with the saints, which is something that always gets my attention. And these are the few sentences. I'm going to read them to you. When we weep, our inner state becomes manifest in our external appearance, as when we speak of someone being disfigured by tears. Conversely, tears register the body and or the mind being overwhelmed by external events, such as a physical injury or a bereavement. Tears literally blur our vision in such a way that we can no longer see the world for tears, and being unable to see it cannot put it at the distance required to act upon it. It's that sentence that really got me. Tears blur our vision so that we can't see the world, because you can only really live in the world. I'm paraphrasing him, you can only really live in the world if you keep it at an appropriate distance. And I think that grabbed my attention when I was reading it this morning, because I knew I was going to be talking to you. And I wanted to ask you this, which is, you live in a place of brokenness and vulnerability, like these stories you were just telling about the kids. I mean, how can you do that day after day, on a much smaller scale? Everybody who watches this video will understand what I mean when I say we all are living in such a broken place that most of us, maybe I can speak for most of us, we just have to like pretend like the news is not going on. And the horrible things that are outside the door are not happening. Otherwise, we can't, get groceries. We can't make dinner tonight. I can't pick my kid up at school, because if I actually lived with the world the way it is right in front of me all the time, I would just fall into a puddle. So how do you not just fall into a puddle? I mean, how do you do this? And I'm not trying to give you an opportunity to be a hero. I really want to know.
Well, sometimes I do fall into a puddle. Something that I've noticed about like the spiritual path is that when I'm on it more intensely, I seem to both feel anguish and pain more intensely, but I also feel joy and love more intensely. So it's never all brokenness and misery, like many of the young people have given me a great deal of joy. Many of my coworkers have also given me much love and much joy. And, there's something just beautiful about being able to see people struggling to be good day in and day out. Um, I would also say, to be honest, for years, I felt like I had the ability to kind of power through all kinds of traumatic experiences and just kind of keep my eyes on the prize of whatever I was trying to, accomplish in terms of housing people and creating, the structures that were needed to protect the young people. Um, I've had people die in my arms. I've had to, bury people. Um, I've listened to people pour their hearts out about the most horrific kind of experiences. I would say like I'm haunted by a lot of the kids' voices telling me their stories and by what their eyes looked like when they were telling me those stories. Um, and I will, a couple of years ago, I got to a point where I couldn't really do it anymore. I mean, I stepped down as the leader of the Ali Forney Center 4 years ago, um, because I started feeling like the receipts were due, like the all the trauma that I'd pushed through for so many years. I had to attend to it on a deeper level, so I felt the need to be in a more quiet place, a more, just not surrounded by people all the time. I mean, I'm still involved with the Ali Forney Center. I I'm helping groups around the country and around the world who are creating housing for homeless LGBT youth, but I'm not like in the trenches the way that I, was for 30 years.
Yeah.
I think like I'm sort of in my St. Francis, like on Alberna stage or something.
You're on the mountaintop?
Yeah, yeah. I'm in a valley, but but I do feel the need to just spend more time like in solitude and prayer at this point in my life, and not so much like being the transformational person. Also my husband's older, he's got health issues, and I feel like I need to attend to him more than the rest of the universe at this point. But
Yeah.
I think that if people are honest, I don't know that you can open yourself in a real way to human brokenness and not be somewhat broken in the process.
Yeah. Or at least
But
acknowledge it.
but I also think like, love is supposed to break us to a certain extent. I mean,
Yeah.
it's like what the Rumi says, you're going to keep getting broken until you're broken open. Uh, I don't know that I'm going to claim that I'm broken open, but I don't know. I think that there's a ravaging that goes hand in hand with love. I think love and suffering are intertwined, and I don't think that we can extricate the one from the other. Um, so I don't. I mean, so I think maybe sometimes you do fall in a puddle.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
just that's part of the process, I guess.
Well, and I'm sure that's what makes love real, if it's combined with suffering, if you're willing to have both together.
Yeah. I mean, but having said all of that, I do that. There's joy. I mean, uh,
Oh yeah.
that there are many young people that have gone on to live good, rewarding lives. Who I get to see them being attorneys and running their dance companies, and there are just many young people that I've worked with over the years who keep in touch with me and let me know what's going on in their lives, and they're city council members in their towns, and all kinds of things. So there's just a lot of suffering, but there's also a lot of joy, and hopefully that balances out.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of which, so tell us the story about Madonna showing up at Thanksgiving.
Well, that's only half the story. So in 2016, when Donald Trump was elected, it was a very demoralizing time at the Ali Forney Center. Where most of us are queer, many of us are transgender and non-binary. Um, Many of my coworkers are people of color. Um, so it felt like we were like a community of folks who were under attack by the new president and his followers. And that a few days, so what election day is like November 7th or something. So, it's like 2.5 weeks later, and I'm sitting in my office, and my development director, Alex, comes into my office and says, uh, Carl, there's a major A-list celebrities representative on the phone. They won't say who the celebrity is, but they're interested in coming to have Thanksgiving dinner with our kids. And then while we're on the phone with this one representative, the phone rings again, and there's a second representative of a second A-list celebrity who won't say who they are yet, but who wants to come the following day with like the Today Show to give out gifts at our drop-in center. And so as we're juggling these two calls, it becomes clear that the one is Madonna and the other is Lady Gaga. And they're both like saying that if we tell anybody, like we can't tell our coworkers, we can't tell our board, like Alex and I are the only ones who are allowed to know that if we say this to anybody, the visits will be off. So we couldn't even tell the other one that, I kind of thought they were maybe tag teaming to see if we could be trusted. Like I thought maybe like they were saying in a way like feuding divas need to come together in this time when, vulnerable populations are under attack because the two of them were not getting along at the time. And
Wait, you mean you knew that? You knew the two of them were not getting along?
oh yeah, it was very public. I mean,
Oh, okay. All right. Okay.
yeah, no, like Madonna had suggested that Lady Gaga had kind of copied Express Yourself for her Born This Way song. And
Oh,
Lady
okay. All right.
Gaga said her musical skills were superior to Madonna's, and their fans were like
Okay. All
attacking
right.
each other, and it was a big thing. So
Okay.
yeah, no, if you were a gay person, you would have been very conscious of this warring between gay divas. But yeah, so they both came. Like Madonna came on Thanksgiving. She brought her several of her adopted children and her chef and her bodyguard and her boyfriend and sat and had Thanksgiving dinner with us. And the next day, Gaga and her mother came with like truckloads of gifts, and it was insane. It was completely insane. And it turned out it was a total coincidence. Neither of them knew the other was coming. Um, but
Did Gaga know that?
for
Did
days
Gaga
after,
know Madonna had been there the day before?
Madonna didn't put it on social media till the next day.
In
Like she
order
took
to
a
show
picture
off
with all of
Gaga's.
us, but she didn't put it on social media until Gaga had already visited. So
Okay. All right. Okay.
so neither knew until like they each put something on social media within about 20 minutes of each other. And then suddenly like the whole gay blogosphere was like exploding with people saying that all of homosexual youth in America are jealous of the kids of the Ali Frenay Center. So but yeah,
Were you able to tell the kids that they were coming?
no, we couldn't. They Madonna made us take everybody's cell phone and lock them up. She even took my cell phone and locked it up. Um,
The pictures.
so like we couldn't tell anybody. So like to get the kids to stay there, like I was like somebody very famous is on their way, and they were all like, "Who is it? Who is it? Who is it? Is it Beyonce? Is it Hillary Clinton?" They were all like trying to guess, and then in walks Madonna. It was insane. It was bizarre.
Wow.
When
Sounds
I
like
was,
fun
it's funny when I was like in my early 20s, mid 20s, when I was coming out of the closet, like Madonna's "Like a Prayer" video was very seminal for me in
though.
trying to imagine what integrating sexuality and spirituality could look like. So I was like a big Madonna fan for a few years. If she had
Sure.
invited herself to my place for Thanksgiving in 1990, I would have had to have been hospitalized.
Well, which, I should pause. I'm talking with Carl Siciliano, author of Making Room. Um, we have time for just a couple more questions. I won't keep it too much longer, but this is making me remember a late chapter in the book where I found it really interesting that in this chapter you talked about realizing all of a sudden that you had political influence that you weren't using. Um, you in the center had gotten to the point where you might actually be able to influence maybe a politician, maybe a civic movement or something. Even though you're the marginalized in many ways, you had some sort of muscle that you were able to exercise. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I was, I guess if you had asked me, like, to describe myself, in terms of political power or something in my youth, I would have said I'm a lover, not a fighter. Um, I was much more interested in just, doing the works of mercy and caring for people. But homeless LGBT youth made up almost half of the homeless youth population in New York City. And all of the city funding was going to this one religious program where the youth couldn't go. So they were just, stuck out in the streets and suffering horribly as a consequence. And I started the Ali Finney Center in 2002, but we weren't getting any significant funding for our first couple of years. And we had hundreds and hundreds of kids on a waiting list waiting to get into our beds. Most of them were sleeping in the subways, and I was just terrified of their getting killed. I mean, Ali Finney was killed. And, as well as a number of other young people that I'd worked with in the early years. So what I realized was that as the LGBT community was getting more political influence in a place like New York City, that I needed to figure out a way to leverage that influence to become like a voice for our disenfranchised youth. Um, and it took several years, but I ended up being very effective at engaging like the political LGBT community into standing up for our kids and saying to the politicians that you can't say you're supportive of LGBT rights if you're going to leave these kids out in the streets. Um, so it got to a point where by like 2014, I'd created this advocacy campaign and it gotten pretty much all the LGBT power players and the media that focused on LGBT issues to be very focused on this as an issue. And when Mayor de Blasio was elected in 2014, in response to our campaign, he invested about $30 million into creating more housing for homeless youth. It was like a profound, profound investment in a population that had been disenfranchised for decades, treated like the wretched of the earth. So it's something that I was very proud of. And I have to say that, in a lot of ways, my vision of activism was kind of rooted in something that the great Sylvia Rivera said to me. I don't know to what extent your listeners are going to know who Sylvia Rivera is, but she was she was a transgender homeless youth herself at the time of the Stonewall riots and had been very adamant that the LGBT rights movement that was emerging should center the needs of homeless youth. And it was very much ignored. Like that was not something that was prioritized in the early years of the movement. She and Marsha P. Johnson actually opened up the very first shelter for homeless queer youth in New York in the early 70s. They called it Star House. Uh, and they pretty much just funded it through sex work. There was no funding available. But we were having a rally at one point, and this was in the last year before she died. And she came to the rally, and I was so honored to have the great Sylvia Rivera with us. And she said to me, "These are our children. Like we own these children. They belong to us, and we have to see them that way." So, I put a lot of effort over the years into trying to create that consciousness within the broader LGBT community. Um, that that if parents are going to disown their children for being queer, then we as queer people have like a particular responsibility to see them as belonging to us and to see ourselves as having an obligation to stand in solidarity with them. So the fact that we were able to, through that, long effort, get the city to invest many, many millions of dollars to provide them with better housing is something that I'm very proud of.
maybe just one last question. We will end with a question about love, because your book ends with some speculation about love, a beautiful meditation on love, the love of God, and a little bit of karma, I thought, there as well, where you tell a story about someone called James Burke, and you talk about, you know, the tradition from which you came that has this view of an afterlife, and what you've come to understand about love and the love of God, and what, you know, the love is that we're supposed to do in the world. Can you kind of conclude our interview here with telling a little bit about James Burke and talking about love?
Sure. So, James Burke was somebody that I loved very much and who loved me. Was one of the young people at Safe Space, the program where I first met Ali and where I first, started doing this work. Uh, James was developmentally delayed, didn't was not very articulate, not very verbal, but was very sweet. Uh, was with us pretty much every day for several years, but we were a youth program and people would age out of our program. And when James turned 25, he aged out of our program. And, we took him to other programs for adults to try to help him get the care that he needed, but he didn't want to leave us. Like we were the ones he loved. And when he aged out, like for 3 days, he just stood across the street, stared up at our building and sucked his thumb. And I couldn't even bear to look out the window. Like it just seemed so horrific to me. And then I never heard about James for years. Like, I would go to the programs where we'd referred him and say, did he come? Is he okay? Nobody knew anything about him. And so many kids in those days would die that I just felt like James had probably died. And I carried all of this guilt, that when James was standing outside the window, like I couldn't bear to look. And it became sort of a symbol for me of my own kind of feelings of inadequacy. Um, there's something about opening yourself to the experiences of destitute people where there's this sense that the need is bottomless and infinite, but you're finite. Like you can't do everything. There's always more that needs to be done than you can do. There's always like more that's called for from you than you know how to respond to. And that always has been a very something that I've wrestled with. Like, this experience of your finiteness in the midst of infinite need. So about 10 or 11 years after James aged out, I was walking down the street towards my office on a bright September afternoon. I remember like I was kind of walking into the sunlight and I saw this man in a hard hat coming towards me. But I couldn't, because of the light, I couldn't see who it was until he was right upon me. And then there it was. It was James Burke. And it, it was this beautiful moment in my life of, just feeling like, okay, there is hope. James survived. He's doing okay. He's working. Um, I told him how happy I was to see him. He was still just saying like yes or no. I mean, like I could never get more than one word out of James. And when I was running late for a meeting, so I gave him my card. I said, James, I hope you give me a call. But then as I was leaving, he grabbed me and hugged me. And it made me think about God and God's infinite love and God's infinite capacity for forgiveness. And how our finite limitations, somehow open up into this capacity for infinite love as we connect to God. Um, I don't know. It was this beautiful healing redemptive moment in my life. And like afterwards, when I was reflecting on it, I remember saying to myself, if I ever write a book about doing this work, I'm going to end with this experience of James, because I felt like it summed it up. That our finiteness, our smallness, our littleness, our poverty opens up into this kind of immensity, which is God's love. And it's such a wonderful thing when things happen in our lives where we can see the reality of that. And that was just a moment where I saw the reality of that.
Well, that's beautiful. And it's a beautiful way to conclude the book. And I think it is a good way to conclude our interview. If you have not yet seen Carl's book, you need to. It is Making Room: 3 Decades of Fighting for Beds, Belonging, and a Safe Place for LGBTQ Youth. Carl, thanks for being here. Best of luck with the book, your ongoing work, everything else you're doing.
Oh, thank you, John. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to talk and for asking such wonderful questions. And for giving me your Julie M of Norwich vibes with your cat.
Oh, yeah. Martin came to say hi right at the end.
Mm-hmm. Well, while
All
we're
right.
talking about infinite love, like we have to get Julian of Norwich in there, right?
Thank you, Carl. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye-bye.